A roadmap for bringing personalized medicine to British Columbians. If you have this paper, this is what this panel is all about. And if you want to have someone pull this together, who are you going to call? Colin Hanson. So Colin is the president and CEO of Advantage BC, a private sector organization dedicated to promoting British Columbia as a center of international business. He was elected to the British Columbia legislature in 1996, and he was named health minister in 2001, a position that he held for 4 years. So Colin knows a thing or two about not only government, but also the Ministry of Health. He served as Deputy Premier as well as the Ministry of Finance from June 2008 to March 2011, and 3 years as Minister of Economic Development, which included the responsibilities for the 2010 Olympics and Asia Pacific Initiative. He serves currently on a number of boards, which include Arthritis Research Centre of Canada, the Fraser Basin Council, and Canada-Japan Society, Jack Austin Centre for Asia Pacific Business. He also chairs the advisory board for the Retirement Concept and is chair of the board for the Transportation Investment Corporation, which is a Crown Corp. Before he was in politics, he also was the president and founder of Image Group with his wife Laura, so he's an entrepreneur as well, and he successfully built the largest promotional company in British Columbia. So, and prior to that, he was vice president of finance and administration for the Asia Pacific Foundation. We're thrilled that Colin has once again accepted to be part of the community and is now challenged with the task of shepherding this panel through the road map for bringing personalized medicine to British Columbians. Colin.
Great, thank you very much, Paul. And before you go very far, you have to take a seat at the panel table along with Sir Malcolm and Sean and Jill, if you can join us, and Renee, who I will introduce once everybody grabs a seat here. So one of the things on my instructions was to introduce all the panel members, but every one of them has been introduced already except for Renee. And to give you a bit of Renee's background, Renee is the president of or executive director of the Better Pharmacare Coalition here in British Columbia, position he's had for the last 4 years. I think that was the last time Renee and I chatted, was just shortly after he took over that spot. But we first met probably about 7 years prior to that, when he was the executive director of the Mood Disorders Association for British Columbia. And prior to that, he spent 30 years with the Vancouver Police Department as a financial crime investigator. So thank you all, five of you, for joining us today. And just from the audience perspective, we're going to take this session through to 5:15, and then Peter's going to do some wrap-up comments, and then we can enjoy some networking after that. But I want to plunge right into this because when I think about personalized medicine, I think back to the first time that I ever was it was brought to my attention what personalized medicine is, or what we now know as personalized medicine. And it was probably about 2002, 2003. I remember exactly where I was at the time. I was at an annual general meeting for Genome BC. And in one of the breaks, I was engaged in this conversation from an individual who was very passionate about what personalized medicine could do for the future of medicine. And my response to that at the time was, we can't afford the healthcare system that we're trying to deliver today. How can we possibly, as a society, afford this huge additional burden and all of this additional technology that's coming at us? And she did a very effective job of sort of walking me through how this is actually an opportunity for cost saving in the healthcare system. We can mitigate costs, we can avoid costs for the betterment of everybody, particularly in our one-payer system, of course, the taxpayer. But one of the challenges I always had as a health minister was when people came forward with new ideas and initiatives that said, basically, you spend $1 today, I guarantee you're going to save $5 4 years from now. That's great. Where do I find the $1 today in order to start that initiative and get down that road? And I think it's sort of the classic upstream, downstream debate that we often use when we're talking about health prevention, is that how do you actually stop pulling people out of the water just before they go over the falls in order to free up the funding and the time and the resources and the energy to go back upstream to help them not get into that crisis predicament in the first place. So the first thing I'd like to put to the panel is, how do we make that transition? How do governments around the world, particularly in Canada and in British Columbia here, how do we make that transition from finding the financial resources necessary to get this PMI started in British Columbia so we can start seeing the tangible results that actually drive the cost savings? So actually, Sir Malcolm, maybe you can start off.
Well, thank you, Colin. This is a really fundamental question because we're trying to disrupt our own industry. And normally industries get disrupted from outside rather than inside. So it's a bit like getting in a 747 in Vancouver with a full plane and taking off and landing in London in a 787 Dreamliner that somehow you've modified en route without disrupting the flight passage. So I think it's possible, you know. But it's easier if you start off with a 787 and do something completely different from the beginning. So that's one of the reasons why this is so tough. I think the critical issue is, and what we will need to be doing in the UK increasingly is looking for transformation funding. But alongside that, you can't transform everything from the inside. And I think what we've heard this afternoon from both Sean and Jill about how the private sector is engaging with this agenda can do two things to the public sector. One, it can set up a competitive model in which each has some advantages that the other doesn't have. You have much greater flexibility. We have outstanding clinical science. Or you can do something on a more collaborative basis. I think we have to open this up to much more interaction between private sector and public sector if we're going to produce for our public a product that is cheap, a product that is reliable and safe, and a product that can reduce downstream strain on our overstretched health systems.
Sean, do you want to pick it up from a U.S. context?
Sure. I'm not sure I have a lot of advice for governments trying to afford healthcare, but I think that certainly I think everyone could agree that not participating, not collaborating, not working with the private sector is a huge mistake in this context, particularly where we are. If there is something I could offer, I would say, even within businesses, even companies that are kind of aware enough to cannibalize themselves through technology disruption cycles, it's well understood that you can't have the same people, the same team do it. So when companies do this kind of thing, they typically set up a small pilot, separate team, separate culture, separate group of individuals, all the rules go out the door, and the new approach is tried, proven, and then with some kind of model established, the company will decide how much of the old business they'll then cannibalize with the new. And I would, like I said, I don't have a lot to offer governments except that in this kind of initiatives, I think probably getting a separate effort with whole new thinkers and culture, and then trying it out in collaboration and sharing with the private industry is the way to go. I don't see whole healthcare systems shifting wholesale without some targeted efforts by people that haven't been doing it a while.
And Renee, you're wearing the hat of patient advocate or consumer advocate, I guess, as we've learned to say this morning. But with a lot of the various groups that are part of the Pharmacare Better Pharmacare Coalition, do you think that there's actually a willingness for people to give up what they're comfortable with, what they know in terms of treatments and approaches, to say, okay, I'm prepared to take that leap and adopt something new and that is something that may be the way medicine is going in the future, as opposed to holding on to what's currently there?
I more than readily admit that almost every patient who's dealing with a chronic disease wants to get better, and if that means that they're going to have to put up with what's happening to them for a little while longer in order to do that, I think probably you'll be able to get them to accept that. However, speaking from the point of view of patients and people, ordinary people who deal with these diseases within their families and for themselves, I want to know why government continues to produce the argument that they can't do more just because they're doing a lot now. We saw the graph today about the Julio Montana's good work in AIDS, and if that wasn't a compelling argument to bite the bullet and spend some more money now in another direction, then I don't know what was. We can't continue to do the things we're doing now. The healthcare system we have now is not sustainable. It will never be sustainable. And I go back to my time in mood disorders. If you continue to do the same things you're doing, expecting different outcomes, you are by definition crazy.
DSM-4 or 5,
Exactly.
whatever we're on.
Yeah. To say that, I have a 1-year budget and I can't go over that, even to enhance my income flow 5 years down the road, I don't know any private company that would still be in business.
Right. Raise more money.
Raise more money. Or, spend some you don't have. We've been operating in deficit in this country on and off for a long, long time. I think politicians are making much now of having balanced budgets. When I first bought my house, 3 years after that, my mortgage rate went from 7% to 26%, and I nearly lost that house. But I continued and persevered and borrowed and did a whole bunch of things that I needed to do to keep myself going so that my picture would look better in the future. And if an individual can do that, the government could probably bend a little bit to do that.
Paul, you.
So, Colin, there's a few things I'd like to add. I think that government has a lot to offer industry, but I think Sir Malcolm illustrated quite nicely is that industry has a lot to offer government as well, and some significant partnerships. I think Sean noted that cost and driving costs down is absolutely critical. I think Jill showed that within a private organization, you can do research at a much faster pace than you can do it in the public sector. And I think we need to look at that and take advantage of it. I just want to go back to your question about how do we implement this in British Columbia, if I may. And I think there's a couple of things. For me, I believe that it's going to be the people in this room. We're all patients. We're here because we're enthusiastic about this. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. Some of those in the room have had sequences done. And I think as a result of that, I would call them first movers. And I don't think we can rely for a government system, because I think we went to Minister Lake and asked him, what do you think of implementing a genomics program in the province? I think we'd get a similar answer to the answer that you gave while you were health minister. We can't afford it. We're trying to bend the cost curve, and this isn't going to be possible. So I'm not sure if government is the place that we go to look for help. I think we look at almost the citizens movement, where the first movers want to be part of something special. They want to be part of not so much an experiment, but a project. And then I think we look, and there's a lot of MDs in this room that I know are first movers. And I think we find those MDs, we go to those MDs, and we engage them in the process. And I think as we do that, we'll build up enough momentum that people will see that this project that we have in British Columbia is something that we can do outside of the healthcare system. And then over time, we look for opportunities to bring it into the healthcare system where it provides meaning and actual cost reductions that have been proven outside of the system already.
So I think the other thing, as you read through the paper, there's some case studies in here of some of the projects that really do produce very quick results in terms of cost reduction, and I think we need to find ways of celebrating those and getting those into the limelight for the politicians and everybody else as well. So, sorry, Sean?
One thing I just thought of from kind of last 10 years experience with Canadian healthcare versus American, that I would point out it is difficult in this country for an individual to pay for their own provision, and I would offer, maybe I do have something to offer. You don't have to go crazy American, but just making it a little bit easier for an individual who is otherwise interested in maybe taking advantage of some of these technologies and contributing to the public domain to actually pay with their own loonies and toonies might not actually be that bad of an idea. And I don't think it will descend Canada into a chaos of segregated provision of healthcare. It may actually help round out some of the corners on these budgeting issues. Just a
Well, I think we might see some progress on that, but it may be the courts are actually driving the agenda, and that may not be a bad thing either. So I'm going to come to there's three ways to sort of inject questions here. So you can put your hand up and I will recognize you, and I've got you first on the list. But before we go there, you can also send a tweet through to that tweet handle, and your question will magically show up on one of these little blue pieces of paper, which I now have. You can also write out a question and pass it down to the end of the row, and someone will try to pick it up from you and bring it down to me. So I want to go to the first tweet question because it's a nice segue from Sean's comments now, and it's a question to Jill. And it is, under what conditions can researchers access the 23andMe database? And second question, why does 23andMe cost $99 in the US and $199 in Canada?
The first question, under what circumstances can researchers access? So we have, our research team will evaluate 3 times a year. They sit and they look at all of the opportunities. We get contacted a lot by academic researchers to collaborate on projects, and we just don't have the bandwidth to do them all. So we kind of have a system for evaluating them and ranking them and engaging them. Going forward, now that we're building out this research portal, we need to come up with a way to contract that and monetize that, but not in, so we have a successful model for pharmaceutical companies, but we don't think that same financial model will work for academics. And we haven't figured out what the sweet spot is yet on the quid pro quo with the academics, and it's still in process. We have a team working on it. And the second question was? The
cost differential.
Cost differential. So in the United States, when we relaunch health, we've done some price elasticity studies, and the value and what people are willing to pay for the product is actually higher than $99. In fact, if you go much lower than that, it's very interesting. People start to distrust it. So there's a certain price point that almost kind of instills a sense of trust and credibility with it. And when we come back out in the United States, we're looking at different pricing structures as well, particularly with additional regulatory costs that need to be factored in.
Okay, so I'm going to come to your question, sir.
It was just a comment about adopting molecular medicine. At Vanderbilt 10 years ago, the only genetic testing that was being done was in the pediatric genetics clinic. And now we send out $12 million a year, and it's growing by about 30% a year. So it's organic. It's happening. It's happening in cancer in a big way, cardiology in a big way. So I don't know if the payment system in Canada is different enough to say that it can't happen that way here, but there's no stopping it. It's just a matter of, could you make it go faster maybe? Actually, I think the price point issue I think you had discussed is what it is. When the price point for a total sequence drops below the level of a single genotype test now, then everybody will just order a total sequence. Yeah.
I think it's also important to point out is that in Canada, under the Canada Health Act, when we talk about how Canadians can't pay privately for their own health care, that applies to 2 areas of medicine. It's doctors and hospitals. It's certainly, a lot of people think it's the whole healthcare system, which is not true. Question here in the third row.
So a few years ago, Janif Ehrlich managed to unambiguously identify some of the participants in the 1,000 Genomes Project using some bioinformatic analysis and some information that was publicly available on the web. And a few months ago, an article came out in Science that showed that the minimal data set to unambiguously identify someone from the financial transactions was about 4 purchases over a period of time. So, I mean, in that context, the concerns around genetic privacy and re-identifiability from a large data set, I mean, are those concerns overstated? Are they understated? Or should they be stated differently? Because I think we've got a variety of different opinions here on the panel.
I'm guessing Sean and I agree, but I'll let him speak.
I'll go first. So I think that I know, of course, we all know of that example. And actually, just for a good read the PGP, read the informed consent for the PGP, and there's literally in there, someone may take your sequence, synthesize some DNA, and spread it around a crime scene, therefore implicating you in a murder. It's literally in the informed consent. So these concerns have been around, for a long time. I think if you look into the details, you have to have a combination of the genetic data linked to some identifier, linked to another identifier, which, as most of the companies in the space, break that apart. As Jill mentioned it, everybody who knows what they're doing spreads that apart to mitigate that risk. But I think though it's more important. The second part of your question is where I come out on is, I don't go to Target very much, but when I do, they know exactly what I'm about to buy, and it's kind of freaky. Some people opt in to that world more than others by having browsers track their activity and using credit cards and tweeting everything, and getting connected. And other people try to stay out of that world, but it's almost unavoidable. I think in general, society is already over that. That's kind of that's a perspective. Society is already over that problem. People deal with it as they do, make their own decisions about their own identity and their location and behaviors and patterns and whatnot. And I think to raise those questions and peg them squarely against genetics is yet another example of genetic exceptionalism. Genetics is a test like any other test. It's information like any other information. And so one perspective on that is, look, society is over that already, and provided you're doing all of the things that are appropriate and sensical to do to protect an individual's information and their privacy, and it just doesn't seem like it's that hard. And I think Jill and I have the same mind. We're making this much harder than it is. You agree to far more egregious sharing of your information every time you update your phone software. Nonetheless, it's a serious concern, but I think this is also one of those things that we'll look back on and kind of think about. It's okay. The benefit far outweighs the concern. One perspective.
Sir Malcolm?
Can I just say, whenever I download my iPhone software, I never read the consent form. Does anybody in this room do that? Because if you do, you're crazy. But can I just disagree with Sean? Because I think this is a really critical issue. It's not about genetic exceptionalism. It's about public trust. And from our perspective, of course, which is a government-funded initiative, if we really are going to bring about a transformation, we have to have the public coming with us. And if there is a risk of patient identifiable information being misused or being disclosed, then we're at risk of subverting the entire program. Hence that red line that we drew around our data set. People can engage with it within the data set, trusted engages, but we are absolutely prohibiting anything else. There is nothing more sensitive in Britain anyway, I don't know about Canada or the US, about patient identifiable information. It is something that is liable to be on front page of every newspaper when we get it wrong, and we do. Stuff does get disclosed, and there are unauthorized disclosures. People still leave CDs in buses and this sort of nonsense. So having to try and get it back within a highly secure environment is critical if we're going to bring about the transformation we want. Because without trust, I fear we're not going to get there.
Renee?
That's a very good point. But I think we get back to a comment that was heard over here today. If you're talking to somebody whose child has a chronic disease that is going to debilitate them, they don't care about how much data they have to release. When I first started in fraud in the police department, we would get a number of cases where people would bring in their credit cards and say they'd been tampered with, or the numbers had been captured, and their money had been taken out of their accounts. Originally, the banks had to have a police report to cover that off. Over time, eventually they just said, "We believe you, and we're going to reimburse you." The practice, as the criminal practice, possibly in this case, becomes greater, the practical practice adapts to it. So there will be a time where that spreading your DNA or getting you charged with murder, O.J. Simpson, might be a concern, but it won't be a concern for that long in the greater scheme of things.
Okay, thank you. I want to. Well, in some of the presentations throughout the day, we've heard the word disruption used frequently. And should the implementation of this personal medicine initiative be a disruption in the style of the Clayton Christensen style of disruption, or should it be more of an evolution to bring the public along? I think there are disruptions as we see them that are quite that sometimes can implode on themselves rather than if they get too aggressive with the technology, which is clearly there today and the science is there. But do we have to be careful in how fast this gets implemented in order to have public buy-in on that? And Jill?
Yeah, I would actually flip it. I giggled a little when you said that we have to bring the public along. We know we've got to bring the healthcare and regulatory and government along. The people want this already. So the disruption is happening the other way. I know you guys don't have Uber here, but I want to make an Uber analogy. You know, when something just gets so much better, faster, cheaper than the incumbent system, it almost doesn't, you know, the pre-existing practices and regulatory framework will eventually be challenged to the point where, I mean, in the United States, right, like all our politicians use Uber now, right? So it's like it's so much more convenient for them personally at this point that it's going to be hard for them to change legislation to put Uber out of business. That said, I hope I didn't just jinx Uber, because they're fantastic.
And actually, from somebody from a perspective of government, it's way easier to implement something where you've got a public demand for it, as opposed to trying to push that string uphill. Paul?
So for years, living in Oxford, I was in the bastion of Formula One, where there's Formula One companies all around the Thames Valley. And when I sit down and watch Formula One races on the weekend, my wife just looks at me and says, "You got to be kidding me! The car's going round and round. What's the point?" So my comment to her is, well, you know that ABS that is on your car. Well, where did that come from? It came from Formula One. So the fact that we didn't have cars skidding into each other or were able to brake on wet roads was a Formula One invention. And I liken this to Formula One. We take that technology that is in the public domain, that people now pay $4,000 or $5,000 in the case of 23andMe, $199, and seriously, $199.99. It's $100. It's our mobile bill for most of us for a month. But I think that what we can do is take the learnings that we have from this citizen movement and really take those learnings there and then move it out to the general population as a result. And the other thing that I think that we need to do is Michael Nielsen wrote a really nice book. He's a computational scientist from University of Cambridge on reinventing discovery. And the premise, other than the green pea galaxy that was found, it was all about bringing citizens together to do something special. And I think that what Sir Malcolm articulated for Genome England and the 100,000 Genome Project, I think we need to tie some of our carriages to that engine. I think we need to look for abilities to network with other nations that are doing this so that we don't have to learn on our own, so we don't have to go through this all the first time. And we can work with Genome England, we can work with the likes of Illumina, with 23andMe, with Invitae, and really look for opportunities to move this at pace. And I think if we do that the right way, we can bring it to government and with so much more robustness of an argument as to why this needs to be implemented across the population base. I think that would be far more compelling for them to get involved.
Great. Sir Malcolm, and then Jill.
I don't think whole genome sequencing is a disruptor. I think it's the beginning, actually. I think that what we've heard today, which is absolutely excellent, to my mind opens the imagination. The disruptor isn't going to occur from people like us doing 100,000 genome sequencing. I mean, it's going to be tremendously important as a global leader for introducing a more molecular model of medicine. But what is the disruptor is the mobile phone, mobile technology. It's the ability of people to control their own data. And that's where I think you get your real privacy built in. I would love to see everybody having, and I don't care what the model of the technology is, but everybody has their own medical records. They can adapt their consents for different purposes. They can do it online. They can draw down the information. Combine that with all the other omics stuff, so moving from horoscope to stethoscope and the ability by yourself to control your own data. That's the disruptor. That's where you get the patient interventions that start to alter the way in which we provide medicine. Now, that's not something that if we as a National Health Service don't adapt to that and don't respond to it, then we're doomed. Because what's already happening, of course, is people do 1, 2, 3 and go and talk to their GP and say, well, what does this really mean, doctor? And that is going to start disrupting the way in which we practice medicine. Going back to, I don't know how many people here yesterday heard Leroy Hood speaking, but I think that was the truly inspirational view of what the whole system might look like in say, 10 years' time, which is real-time monitoring of one's individual health and a focus on wellness rather than on disease and curatives. And in there lies the Clay Christensen model, I think, for health and healthcare.
Jill.
I was just going to kind of riff off what other folks have been saying, kind of pull it together. Taking a smaller group of people who opt into this. For 23andMe, you don't have to do this. This isn't part of your national healthcare system. This is an optional thing for people who are curious and want to do it. And much like, online banking in the early days, and probably even today, there's people who didn't trust it. They were not the early adopters. They're not the ones who should be doing this or be forced to do this. So it kind of gets back to that consent and privacy question, where we try to do everything we can, obviously, and to do it as right and securely as we can. But if you're really nervous about that, you probably shouldn't be in this early adopter, tiger team that even Sean had described, like the small group of people who goes off to figure out kind of how we could do this completely differently. And that is both from the healthcare system and from the consumers of the healthcare are that smaller unit, I think, of people who are willing to go first. And then a lot of these issues become, I think, a little bit more tractable because you don't have to get it completely perfect as if you were deploying it to the entire country. And you can kind of test and have a more controlled, a less ambitious, smaller project that is tractable, that has endpoints that are achievable, and then you can build on blocks from there.
We've got a question in the very back.
I'm Alicia Main. I study innovation and disruptive innovation amongst them. And I agree that personalized medicine is disruptive to the way that we practice medicine and not to the population. And your comments are very good on that. Clayton Christensen would say anything that gives a service to a larger population in a more convenient way is a disruptive innovation, but critically not disruptive to the end consumer. My question is for Sir Malcolm and about the way that you've built the industry consortium to collaborate with in the large firms and the small firms. And I liked that you made room for small firms in that consortium, and we've seen today the amazing role that small startup companies can have in commercializing radical innovation. I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about how you structured that consortium and what rights and responsibilities the small firms had compared to the large firms.
Okay, I'm a bit limited by commercial confidentiality around it, but let me just set out what the model is. We decided that what we wanted to do was to provide an opportunity. It's mainly big pharma. So it's the lineup that you would expect. We set ourselves a goal of attracting 10 big pharma to come in by the end of March. In fact, I think we've now got 12. They are set a price to enter that consortium, and the price is set at a level which reflects to us any drainage of IPR as a result of their involvement, but there are also other sharing schemes. I mean, big pharma are reluctant to go in for long-term profit sharing, but we've got a model there. For the smaller companies, we didn't set a price barrier, and nor did we set a time, because we wanted to leave this open for people to be able to come in at any time and to use the data. Can I just talk about banking? There's a very nice comparison. A few months ago, I brought in the leadership team of one of the world's biggest banks to talk to the NHS board about how they had weaned consumers onto mobile banking. And the answer was they could have done the whole thing straight away, but actually what they did was do it bit by bit to build the trust. So first of all, you could check your balances. And secondly, you could move stuff about. And then thirdly, you could start to pay bills. And then fourthly, you could run the whole thing. And I was very interested in that. But the underlying thing, the really disruptive thing, was that they invested £2 billion in bringing about that transformation against a return of $2 billion recurrent annually thereafter. So your earlier comment, Colin, about how one needs to invest up front, I think is fully borne out by that transformation.
Thank you. A couple of tweeted questions here, and it's clear that there's at least two of you in the room on the same wavelength on a particular subject area. How do you propose that the life insurance industry should manage narrowed probability of illness? And another question, discussion of potential for genetic discrimination, no legislation in Canada to protect against it. And Jill, I'm going to start with you and then I'm going to go to Renee on this question here, because I know on the 23andMe website there's actually a plea for Canadians to encourage the adoption of new legislation. I think it's actually a bill that's coming out of the Senate. The Senate does some things that are good, but I guess the other side of it, it's not making progress through Parliament. So Jill, maybe if you could comment on that initially, then I'm going to ask Renee to comment on it.
So in the United States, we have GINA, the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, which I think passed in 2008 or 2009. And it deals with health and not being discriminated against for health insurance and some other things, but it actually still has the gap where you could, in theory, be discriminated against for life insurance or disability insurance. Therefore, our genetic counselors or people involved in genetic testing usually advise people to get your life insurance and disability insurance in order before you get your genetic test. At the same time, in the United States, to my knowledge, and I've talked to a lot of people, but maybe just not the right people, there really hasn't been any cases. Like, this is more of a hypothetical bad thing that could happen than an actual bad thing that is a problem that we need to fix. In Canada, as I understand it, there have been some cases of genetic discrimination, or at least health-related discrimination with health insurance, disability insurance, and life insurance. And because of that, there is a movement to get a GINA-like law in Canada, and 23andMe has been involved. We've been talking to the key opinion leaders, as well as to the people in the government about what we can do to help, and if there's anything we can do to help. I understand that it's moving along. I thought like in October there was going to be a vote. Did that ever happen? Something was supposed to happen last October. Oh, look, we got somebody who knows.
Yeah, I do know. Unfortunately, the Conservatives decimated the bill so that they could introduce their own, which they announced this morning.
Oh,
Renee, do you want to comment?
Oh, good. They announced it this morning.
And is my understanding correct that there have been some cases in Canada of real genetic discrimination?
Yes, that's correct.
So it is a thing for everybody to be aware of and be engaged in and be encouraging, legislatively to not do that. That said, I think the insurance company has an interesting point of view to be heard as well. I don't agree with their point of view, but it is an interesting point of view that should be heard.
Yeah. Thanks, Colin. It's shameful that Canada does not have this legislation in point of fact right now. There's been certainly been enough similar legislation throughout the world to encourage one of the leading G8 countries to do the right thing by their people. Having said that, I'm glad to hear that it is coming. I'd be interested to see what the legislation actually says. But in terms of insurance companies, I would encourage the legislators to include the same restrictions on insurance companies as anybody else would have to keep them from discriminating against something for which you cannot, or something which you cannot prevent, something that you have no authority over or no control over. They'll have to work out another way to build their tables and set their price mechanisms.
There's another question that came in via Twitter that it's still in this area of some of the ethical questions around personalized medicine. Please talk about the approach to ethical issues, non-paternity, this next word I can't pronounce, not to know versus duty to inform.
Is that missing word consanguinity?
Yes, thank you. Did you send this tweet in? Jill, or Sean, you may want to pick up on this one too.
Sean can give more of in the diagnostic space, and then obviously we have this in the direct-to-consumer as well. But.
Yeah, and for the diagnostic stuff, this is kind of already built into the system. It's understood. Non-paternity rates vary by decade. Over beers, you can guess which decade it goes to 10% and which decade it to 2%. But that's all taken care of in the kind of the provision of this care, as is consanguinity, or I don't know, there's a layman's term for it, consanguinity. So I think in terms of kind of those ethical issues preventing a wider use and accessibility of these technologies for the current care, I would offer that isn't going to slow this kind of thing down. And again, even today, these tests are being run and those issues persist. And again, the utility of them is great enough to where those issues are handled in due process. Now, for the other...
In the direct-to-consumer side, it's a little different. We try to make it very clear in the consent process that you're looking at your DNA, you're going to see things that you cannot unsee. You could see that you have a BRCA mutation. You could see that your dad is not your dad. If you do not want to see these things, you should not be buying this service. This is not the product for you. And we try to make it very clear. Going forward, we'll be comprehension checking that better and documenting that over time, that consumers are actually understanding these points up front. That said, we do get occasional feedback from people or an occasional story in the press about what was the one that was out like maybe 6 or 8 months ago. I think the guy bought 23, he was a scientist actually, he liked it and he did it and thought it was funny. He bought 23andMe for his mom and dad for a Christmas present. Dun, dun, dun. And they do it, and then he is on Relative Finder because he had opted into Relative Finder, and he sees that he's got a half-brother. And so then he goes back to his dad and says, what's up with this? What's wrong with this? It says I have a half-brother, and through this process somehow, I think the title of the article was 23andMe and Divorce, or I gave my parents a divorce for Christmas, or something like that. So apparently this marriage fell apart after revealing this illegitimate child. And in the article, the guy fully admits, I did consent. I fully understood in the consent process that this could happen. And so, I don't want to say that 23andMe didn't consent me, they did. But then this bad thing happened. But in all fairness, there's been a lot of wonderful stories through Relative Finder as well, and people connecting. It's a completely optional experience. You don't have to do it if you don't want to. And I don't know, maybe that marriage wasn't that solid to begin with.
So I've got one more tweeted question here, and I'm going to pose it to you, Paul. How do we build in the capacity for the other omics to inform the genome projects already in progress? I don't fully understand the question, and I'm hoping that you do.
So I do, but I'm not sure if I'm the best one to answer it. I think where we start is we start with genomics, with the first movers, willing volunteers, and then we look at, similar to what Dr. Hood spoke of, where he has the 107 pioneers, where I understand, and correct me, Brad, probably you know this better than I, and Peter, but as I understood it, genomics was the baseline, the foundation, and then after that it went to proteomics, metabolomics. So I think it's going to be an evolution rather than a revolution. I think we need to get the baseline set. We need the people who are willing to have blood drawn on a regular basis, be part of a group that's going to move this forward, and then determine the types of analytics. If I may, while I have the floor, Colin, if I can just come back to two things. So first and foremost, our British Columbia government is here, and I want to thank Heather Davidson, first and foremost, for taking 2 full days out to be fully engaged in this conference. She's been in all the sessions. She's been last night And Heather's from the ADM, from the Ministry of Health. Heather, I just want to thank you for being here. And I think that shows the engagement. I also want to thank Greg Cause from BC Innovation Council. Greg has been throughout this as well, and that works with the Ministry of Technology, Innovation, and Citizen Services. And the reason why I point that out is I think we have a group here that's willing to get involved in this conversation. I'm not suggesting that Heather necessarily needs to be driving this at the point in time, but it shows a willingness from our government to actually participate in this conversation. The other thing on page 15 of engaging stakeholders, I think the insurance industry, Colin, we need to engage them significantly in this. You know, Pacific Blue, as Paul Casey said the other day, or yesterday, put on a great conference with the Vancouver Board of Trade. And it dealt a lot with the issues of government and delivery of government health care. I think Pacific Blue would be excited to get involved in something like this and talk about how we pull this to the community. And finally, I'm thrilled that Renee is here. My ask is that we need to broaden patient groups and patient involvement in this. If we are to build the groundswell of enthusiasm behind this and have the public come with us, we're going to need more of their involvement as well.
And the question? About the omics and where's the question here again?
Yeah, I had
how do we build the capacity for the other omics to inform the genome projects already in progress?
Right, I had a thought on that, and particularly as it relates to the green paper. I think some of the specifics of specific applications of genetics for public health in the green paper, I think are fine. I think there's some that are obvious and missing. The thing is, I think all of that's happening, and it will become clear. I think the thing that could really move things along, and is the role, and is by anybody's view a really good and appropriate and useful role for government, is to establish the standards of the transfer of information, the ownership by the individual and transfer of the information. Because everything you've heard is that where this is heading is there will be patient-owned data. The patients will be sharing all kinds of data, omics data, other data, survey data, GPS data. So that's how this is going to work, and it's going to work either by the hundreds of companies that are going after this now. As that dwindles down to 5 or 6, they'll establish standards between them because look, this has been done before. This is how this works. Or in some cases, I'm thinking kind of ICANN or TCP IP, or in our country the allocation of spectrum for different technologies. There is a role for government to say, hey, we're going to create this database, this record for these individuals, and here is the criteria on transfer in and out of these databases on behalf of the individual. And the government can actually dictate to my favorite kicking dogs of personalized medicine, or the EMR companies. You can dictate to the EMR companies, you will transfer data in and out with this government-owned entity. You will abide by these standards, or you will not vend EMR services to the provinces and the citizens of Canada. And I think that's one, that question I think can really handily be answered by government, creating and enforcing transfer protocols that can then really get the space moving. The companies, look, like I said, the companies will do it on their own as a natural part of competition for the space, but it'll be much faster if a government were to say, hey, here's how it's going to work, and everybody will go for it. It's just a thought.
Great. Diane.
Thanks, Colin. So those of us who've been here for a couple of days definitely have the impression that the revolution is happening, and it's happening around us. It's happening fast, and life will look really different in this regard in the next 5 to 10 years. It's just going to happen, and we're not going to stop it. So the question I think that we've been posing for ourselves is, what is BC's role? What's BC's advantage, if I can say that? What are our assets, and what should we be doing? Yesterday somebody asked Lee Hood, I think it was Brad, should we be a fast follower? And he said quite definitely, no, we shouldn't be a fast follower. And I think that's right, because what does that mean? We're not going to replicate 100,000 genomes anytime soon. We don't necessarily have the 23andMe database or something like that. So we need to think about what are the assets that BC has that might give us our own advantage or our own innovation, and then how can we bring those things together? And it may not be just BC, maybe it's Canada. And I can think of a few things. I mean, in BC, we have the rebuild of St. Paul's Hospital, which is an amazing opportunity. It's going to take, 10 years or whatever it is to rebuild it. Isn't that an amazing opportunity to plan for how the world's going to look in 10 years? In Canada, we have some interesting cohorts going on. We have the Canadian Longitudinal Study on Aging. Are we really utilizing something that has a huge amount of data that may not be what you've got in the 100,000 genomes or what some of the other exemplars are that we can build on? So it strikes me that the conversation should be not, should we be a fast follower? Should we do 100 exemplars of our own like Lee has done? He's already done it, so why would we want to do it again? Part of it is that education process, but I think more importantly, what are the assets? And we have some really outstanding genetics and genomics researchers. We have lots of other assets. How can we put them together in a way that we're doing something unique in this space? It's sort of a question, I know, but maybe more rhetorical than people want to answer. I'm not sure. I mean, Paul, what do you see in our climate that suggests we have some things that are an advantage instead of just a kind of I'll be critical and say a Me Too exercise?
Yeah, again, Brad's probably in the better position to comment on this than I, but I think when we were over in England in January, talked to a number of people, and I was excited to be involved in the meeting with Genome England. I think there's a lot of excitement around the Genome Science Center and what's going on at the BC Cancer Agency. So I think that's one thing that one of our jewels in the crown, if you will, that we could hold out and see if that's something that we can offer as part of global participation or just a Canada UK participation. I think the other thing that we have is, and again, I'll sound like a broken record, and I apologize, but I think we have a number of willing volunteers. I think there's there's enough willing volunteers in this room right now that people are willing to come together and say, how do we make this happen and how do we make this work? And I would say that's an asset, because coming to British Columbia as I have 2 years ago from the UK, I mean, the entrepreneurialism here is significant, and I think we can get companies involved. I also look around. I look at the prostate center. There's heart and lung. There's so many different pieces that we can bring, Diane, and ask the people: do you want to participate in a truly global movement around genomics and personalized medicine? And I think we have those discussions, and we look for those opportunities. I think they're there. Perhaps, Brad, can I ask you just to comment on the discussions with BCCA and thinking about that cohort that was of interest to Genome England?
Thanks, Paul. So we've identified 4 things. We've done a real scan of where we're at, and we've compared notes with Genome England and with other groups around the world. And basically, in cancer, in rare disease, in infectious disease, and in pharmacogenetics, we believe in those 4 areas we have very significant opportunity. The rare disease is a funny bucket, right? Because there's a lot of things that fall into that. Everything from cardiovascular disease to neurological disease, neuromuscular disease. I mean, it's a big basket. But it means it's, again, Jill's example where we're just looking at diseases and Sean's also, where you have high genetic loads, and these are things that are discernible now by doing genomic analysis and actionable in many cases. So I think that at the BC Center for Disease Control on the infectious disease side, we have some longitudinal cohorts that go back decades. I mean, that are they're magic. They have, they're complete longitudinal cohorts. That's the phenotypic information that's required by the genotypers, no matter if it's transcriptomics or genomics or whatever omics you're using. The same thing on the at the BC Cancer Agency. Same thing, where phenomenally rigorous. I mean, first of all the patients are seen. All 24,000 new cases of cancer are seen through one center, and that centralization of that cancer care, again, gives an opportunity for the Invites of the world, the 23andMe's of the world, partnerships with Genome England that just don't exist in many other parts of the world, to have that comprehensive a collection of cases. And I could give the other examples also. We heard the pharmacogenetics example yesterday on the adverse drug reaction. So I think that we have some great assets, and it's a matter of just, us, this meeting has been phenomenal to kind of lay out a bit of the groundwork that we need to do to really make those assets of value to other parts for partnerships, both in BC here, but in Canada, but across boundaries. And
I'd like to add, Diane, I think you raised it. St. Paul's, I think the rebuild of St. Paul's is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity that many of us are going to see. I'm not planning on leaving this earth anytime soon, but I think over the next 10 years, to think about what Joel Dudley talked about at ICON, where they have 33,000 patient, both genomics and as I sort of got it, there's significant samples there. Could we have St. Paul's be that for us here? Could we look at St. Paul's being a new model? I mean, that's quite exciting. And I think, again, to bring together a group that wants to see that happen here in British Columbia, it's doable. We just need to be willing to make it happen.
So if Diane Doyle's not here, but I can see her beaming when you say that. So we're into the last 5 minutes. We're going to wrap up. I'm going to take a question from Jim Russell, but before I do that, I just want to give everybody a heads up. Just as we close, I want you to think about, in 45 seconds or less, what advice you would have for the committee that did so much great work in drafting this green paper. But before we do that, I'm going to take Jim's final question.
So I won't tell another economist joke, but I will come back to economics. And I question Gordon's here still, Gordon Bernard at Vanderbilt. We heard his presentation this morning, and Sir Malcolm. In your projects, how much have you embedded health economic outcomes? Because I can see that even in the Genome England, where you're not going back and using the data to drive care, you could model that, though, and you could take the what-if scenarios if this patient had known about this clopidogrel variant or this warfarin variant. I guess what I'm asking is, how much are you investing in bringing to the international community better health outcomes evaluation? Because I think as a taxpayer, we do have to be careful how we're spending our money. We do have to choose between, more MRIs versus more personalized medicine. So maybe if Sir Malcolm and Gordon could just comment on the role of health outcome evaluation in their projects.
The short answer is that it's built into the program, and it's been ongoing for a couple of years now. It's a 5-year project. Don't have the data to answer your question, but yes, we're measuring it. And in real, not just hypothetical, but in real time, real patients.
As far as we're concerned, I shouldn't have given the impression that 100,000 genomes is not about treating our own population. Of course it is. But what it means is that these early patients who are giving samples are not necessarily going to benefit from that directly. We're trying to create a wealth of knowledge as to how we treat patients. I think secondly, I'm very taken by this discussion about the rebuilding of St. Paul's Hospital, because it seems to me that we in the UK certainly have invested everything in hospitals for the past 2 decades. But we've lost that word acute. Hospitals used to be about acute conditions, and hospitals increasingly are being used by people with long-term chronic conditions, sometimes people who are staying on longer in hospital because we have not provided in primary care and in community facilities the alternative accommodation for them. So one of my challenges, I think, in this province would be, what can personalized medicine do in conjunction with primary care? I mean, we tend to think of personalized medicine as the great laboratories and computing facilities in the cloud, as opposed to what happens to patients in handling their own health and in working with primary care. So what would St. Paul's rebuild look like if we came away from the gleaming cathedrals of science and provided a facility that was oriented more to a primary community model of healthcare and prevention?
So in terms of just quick wrap up, sorry, Sean. Great, Jill?
Okay, since you brought it up, I couldn't resist. So bouncing around in my head on the St. Paul's conversation, which I didn't say, but now I will, which you would never do, but I think that the answer, think about this answer, don't rebuild it. Turn it into a park. Medicine, the living room, right? Think about the patient, or I really like the primary care. Don't build a gleaming cathedral technology. Get some really good PCPs that have a connection with the individual as a patient, and then take the data that's available, provided handily by the world of techno, whatever you want to call it, that are providing it, and deliver individualized care that matters for the individual. I think maybe something more along that line is a way to think. I don't really mean turn it into a park, but I think instead of making a bigger, shinier, gleamier technology version of a hospital today, maybe think more patient, more living room, more data, less procedure, more, that anyway.
Well, I mentioned the name of Diane Doyle earlier, and for those of you who don't know who Diane is, she is the head of Providence Healthcare and has a responsibility for the new reinvention of St. Paul's Hospital, and I think she was channeling Sean right there, because I think that's exactly where that's going.
And just real quickly, again, think more of like preventing people from getting sick than building a cathedral to treat sick people. And what does that new building look like? And it actually feeds back to the health economic question. We've got some big studies that have been ongoing for a few years now. We have some preliminary data coming out. There was a publication in Genetics and Medicine, I think November of last year, from Veenstra at University of Washington that looked at the ACMG incidental findings and did a cost effectiveness modeling out of it. Actually showing, we can talk about it later, but the price point at which this actually becomes cost effective to do it, to screen the population for the ACMG incidental findings. There was also some papers that just came out this week from ESHG, again showing that when they find these incidental findings in one of the big studies, it's the Caesar study, then they call them back in. So like if they see a pathogenic variant in FH, familial hypercholesterolemia, and then they bring the patients back in, and then once you actually sit down and do a more in-depth questionnaire of them and testing of them, you actually do get that phenotype to declare itself. So we are actually missing diagnoses, and FH is thought to be 1 in 200 nowadays. And you have completely different risk profiles for those than garden variety cholesterol. There's huge untapped opportunities that are pretty easy to get to and tractable. And you can build a preventative hospital to do that instead of a park.
So we've hit the magic time of 5:15, but I'm just going to give each of the panelists a very quick opportunity for final words. Sir Malcolm.
Oh, gosh. A final word. I found the Green Paper really interesting. I think it maps very closely onto what we're doing in the UK, but I think we still have to identify what are the specific advantages of British Columbia in doing something that's uniquely different. I think Brad gave us some of the answers to that. I would go back to what I was saying before. I think move away from the Cathedral of Science model and to think about what personalized medicine does for individuals and their relationships with primary care. There's something that I don't know of any other jurisdiction that's currently really tackling that head on.
Renee?
From the patient perspective, I've found this a really good paper, but I don't think it goes far enough. I really think that you could have, the scope could be much bigger and much more directed. And I understand that one of the reasons that it wasn't is there's a certain expectation that government will not move as quickly as they should, and somebody introduced it as trying to push rope. Don't let government up. The 1961 announcement of a moonshot by the end of the decade was undertaken with very little in the way of resources. They didn't even have some of the materials they were going to need to make the thing happen. What they did have was a dynamic leader who stood up and said, "We're going to make this happen. I give you all permission to do the things you need to do," who then stepped out of the way. And it's a testament that it happened 6 years after the man died, just because he instilled the belief that it could happen. We have to start thinking about benefits to the patient and not hurdles within government or within the system.
Sean?
Yeah, so first, this great paper. I think it is a testament that everyone here is thinking about this. I think that's admirable in and of its own. These are the right questions to ask. I would only offer, I'll just offer to leave you with, again, reiterating the disruptive perspective that this is happening. And this information is going to start coming along for free. And whether you prepare or not, you're going to, women are going to get carrier tests and other stuff's going to come along with it. And pretty soon the public's going to start asking, why do 2% of births have, serious problems, things that cost the taxpayers a lot, when it's information that is entirely knowable. If the average age of conception is 28 years, that information existed for 28 years and was never acted on, and yet we bear the cost as if you know anybody who's dealt with that, it's a horrific cost. It can be prevented simply by information. Drugs were a big theme here, right? How many times is someone going to have an adverse effect that actually is a serious adverse effect? How many Stevens Johnson's kids how many of those events are going to happen where otherwise that information could have been acted on, until people just throw up their hands and start demanding the use of some of this information in personalized medicine. I think that if you see where the technology curves are, this is absolutely happening. So exciting to see people grappling with what to do about it. But again, it's coming.
Great, Jill.
I guess I would say my advice would be, you're not starting from scratch. This movement has been happening for several years in bits and spurts and by different groups. Spend some time on PubMed. Don't relearn things you don't need to relearn, or at least build your hypotheses based on the data that has already been generated and is out there. Find a place where there's easy wins. Maybe all of the cancer sequencing versus the normal genome. I mean, in a research perspective, that's great. From an actual clinical utility and a payer definition of it, it's a little bit further away. I think we're going to get there. But there's some easier wins right now in preventative testing, where the clinical validity of these connections are already there. And there's well-established preventative guidelines that already exist for what you can do if you know these people have that. And then instead of, again, necessarily thinking you need to do all of the sequencing yourself, because that's really the boring commodity part of this story. The interesting thing going forward is what does healthcare look like in P4 medicine, or I actually call it P5 medicine. I added a 5 onto Lee's 4. The fifth P is philanthropic and the participatory research.
Paul, you get the last word.
Sure, thank you. So I think we talked about it before. We go for early movers. We have responsibility, those of us that have been involved with either 23andMe or have had sequences before, we need to find those physicians that want to be part of our healthcare and get to them, which talks to Lee's wellness piece. So that's first and foremost. And then I think we bring that group together and have a discussion, and then we look at bringing others into that. I think that's an easy way to start this in motion. I think, we're risk adverse as a nation. There's a lot of concern about security and privacy. I think we can get around it by a small group showing that it is possible. And I think that, in the conclusions of the white paper, I think it sets out some timelines there. We need to articulate what are the deliverables and how we're going to measure how close we're getting to them. But I think, for 25,000, we can start small. If we get 1,000 and every year we get 1,000 more, we're very quickly we're going to increase our numbers. And if we had 6,000 in the province in 3 years' time, I'd say we're doing all right. So let's set the goals that are realistic. I think we absolutely have to network with other nations, the UK, Australia, the US, and learn, particularly, anti-discrimination laws, which have been around. I know when I was at Genzyme, part of what we did with rare diseases was help drive some of that legislation. And I think the other thing is, I said it before, there's a lot that government can gain from industry, and there's lots industry gaining from government. We need to change that dialogue. And I think that the final piece is there are some really easy jewels that we can look at. Pop Data BC, Nancy, you weren't going to get away without me saying something about that. 30 years of public health records. Is there the opportunity for us to actually look at linking genomics to that? And finally, there's individuals like, I'm sorry to call him out, but Tom Elliott, who, really motivated to do different work and has data sets available as well. Let's look for those opportunities and bring like minds together to move this thing at pace.
Right. And there's no question this is the start of something quite exciting, I think, in this province. So I'm going to turn the microphone over to Peter. I know that Jill has to slip out to catch a taxi, but perhaps the rest of us can grab a seat while Peter finishes his remarks.